Awesome. Let me go ahead and start sharing. I have a theory for why my connection keeps going in and out, and so I'm testing it here. Hopefully, I won't drop from the meeting randomly. So we'll see. All right. I think my screen is visible. Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is. Oh, go ahead, Lynn.
Oh no, I thought you were asking if people can see it. Yes, we can see it. Sorry.
His experiment did not work.
That's funny. So yeah, my theory didn't not pan out. If somebody else want to share just for reliability purposes.
I can do that, please.
Thank you, Mitch. Goodness gracious. I blame AT&T. Okay. So first of all, thank you to the TOC for reviewing and approving the approving the stock directionally on this high level scope. Mitch and I have iterated through some of the details here. There are a couple of changes to the implementation details that was previously in the doc. And so wanted to go through those today and start getting folks' opinions as we push for approval on the actual implementation of this proposal. Again, kind of recapping high level scope, we're talking about multi-network ambient, where we're going to use double HBone as the encapsulation mechanism for communication across multiple clusters in a single ambient mesh. Support for service addressing. We do get into the specific encoding of the service in this doc, and then keeping the door open in the future for SNI pass-through potentially. Gonna go back over the goals right quick because there are a couple of them. It's changed slightly. Minimize special case handling for HBone and clients and services. That makes sense. Keeping cluster.local cluster local. I sort of wish Costin was here, so because I know this is something that he's been pushing for a long time. But that is one of the major goals of this proposal. And for those of you who might not be aware, what this means is in the current existing Istio implementation of multi-cluster, sending traffic to a cluster.local host name, so like the regular Kubernetes namespace service cluster.local, that will forward your traffic across the entire cluster. And so an express goal of this design is to be able to prevent that from happening in Ambient.
So Keith, do you want to tackle those one by one, or are you just kind of like run through a summary and then we'll just come back to them?
Yeah, I'll run through the summary of the goals, and then if there's any contention with the goals, we can discuss. How about that?
Okay.
Cool. We want to ensure that we don't expose services to the public internet unintentionally. One of the things about east-west gateways is that they tend to have publicly routable IP addresses, so you want to make sure that we don't expose kind of a poke a hole in a security posture. You want to follow support use cases where control planes don't know about every endpoint in the mesh for scalability purposes. We want to follow internet standards as closely as possible, and we want to make sure that any changes that we make are reasonable and maintainable to implement in both zTunnel and Envoy for the sidecar and waypoint use cases. Those are top level goals. Louis, I'm guessing you've got a comment on at least one of them.
Well, let's because I'm also note taking. All right, so cluster.local, start at cluster.local addressing as strictly cluster local, right? Just like all right, so there's a few obvious problems here. The first, there's a non-trivial percentage of the existing user base or potential existing user base that finds value in not having to change DNS addressing for their applications to continue to work. Right, so there's that. Like, I've been in customer calls, quite a few of them over the last 2 weeks, And I heard that several times, actually. And so while I'm not opposed to supporting other addressing schemes, I don't know if we can just throw this particular baby out with the bathwater. Or at the very least, provide some means for a customer to choose whether they want, what they want the semantics of their DNS to be.
I hear that, and that you are. I agree with the overall friction there that you're raising. Right, is that part of the attractiveness of a mesh solution is it's easy to onboard. You don't have to change a bunch. Um, Having said that, I do think that from a aligning with standards perspective as well as a correctness perspective, I think Kubernetes has sort of been fairly clear as to kind of what the expectation is for cluster local addressing. I recognize that Istio has been around before that understanding, before that conclusion was made by the community. But I think part of the ethos of Ambient is to be able to sort of it gives us opportunity to address some of these things that would just be an absolute non-starter in Sidecar. And so I think where I land on this is, yeah, I think it's reasonable to allow users to continue the current behavior, but I would like to actually be a bit more opinionated on what the correct scheme should be. And if users want to opt in the Istio style, then we, at some point make that possible. But in fact, I like to toss it over to Mitch because I think in a lot of the surveys we've seen about Ambient, we're in a lot of cases looking at new Istio users who don't have a lot of that behavioral expectation baked in. And again, I think it's a great opportunity to sort of lean on current best practices as we know them today versus what the state of the art was 6 years ago when Istio's multi-cluster is first being designed.
Yeah, if we need a migration path for existing users, then I'm totally in favor of an install time parameter that would allow them to continue routing cluster.local traffic over multi-cluster connections. At this point, we don't support migration from sidecar mode to ambient. So it doesn't seem like it's a high priority, but install time parameters are cheap.
Right. I mean, this wasn't just like the people I was talking to, they weren't just migrants per se, right? They were also potential net new adopters, large ones, where service addressing controls were a major issue for them. And they liked the fact that Istio offered them a no-touch redefinition of their DNS semantics to what they wanted, right? Which was workload portability across cluster, particularly in a world where we're seeing a lot. There was a trend, I guess, in Kubernetes for a while, or in certain companies, to go to a small number of very large clusters. And what I'm seeing, at least in a fair number of customers now, is a trend slightly the other way to a larger number, not a cluster per team model, but a larger number of more moderately sized clusters, right, in the kind of 500, 300 node range, and not, the 6,000 to 10,000 node range style cluster. In that world, right, there's a lot of cross-cluster connectivity within the same VPC. And so that presents a lot of challenge, right, for cluster refactoring to people.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's a trend that others are seeing, but it's definitely one that I'm seeing.
I'm curious for these users, writing DNS rules for whether they're using core DNS or whatever their particular cloud provider provides. Is that not an acceptable solution for them, or?
Well, I mean, core DNS isn't going to core DNS doesn't solve multi-cluster discovery very well, right? Nobody should try and use core DNS for that. Right? The problem is not like, can I define names? The problem is, what are those names bound to dynamically at runtime? And what are the semantics of load balancing?
Okay.
So like, I'm totally fine with saying like there are choices here for users to make, but I don't think it's just a flag, right? Like I think this is something that requires a lot more, may need to be a higher level first class thing in what we do. Right, a policy API. Right, because I guess the alternative model being discussed is the MCS style model, right?
Right.
there's a-
Like,
which is-
go ahead.
Right, which is an explicit policy style API for mapping service discovery stuff into DNS domains. But it's very granular, right? It's very infrastructural.
It seems like those are solving different problems, right? Like the
Yeah.
MCS in this case is really just providing an IP address that represents a multi-cluster service.
Right.
In your case, what you're talking about is when I route to a given service, am I going to be routed multi-cluster or not using a default name? That sounds like an AAA record in DNS to me, where you say foobar points to this service dot cluster set dot local, right? And now when I go to foobar, I'll get routed multi-cluster.
Or more, or a setting at the, because in the multi-cluster case, oftentimes with Istio, you're either having ztunnel be your DNS proxy or either sidecar your DNS proxy. And so it's a setting for the configuration since that DNS proxy as far as what records to generate.
Yeah, so I guess there's these styles of policy APIs, right? One, you could say, do this inside, your DNS implementation, right? And there will be N DNS implementations, right? So we'll have to give guidance to everybody on how to do that across them all. The alternative is to, right, since Istio provides a consistent DNS capture, is to declare, right, have some policy API available to the admin, which says, look, services that match these labels or label constraints should be treated in this way. Services that match these labels and these label constraints should be treated in this way. And then, also controls over the automatic creation of an alternate DNS domain for some services, right? Like instead of clustered, I'm not a big fan of cluster set.local, by the way, but service.global instead of cluster.local, right? Something like that. That we control and that we can give a consistent experience to users for, right? I guess there's this whole other question about like, if we try to do this exclusively through DNS tooling, like, is it actually going to work and will it be consistent? Like telling people you have to go program core DNS or your cloud provider's DNS or what other DNS implementation some Kubernetes implementation happens to ship under the hood.
So for what it's worth, what I'm proposing in this doc is Istio comes with the MCS implementation sort of out of the box. So if you're using Istio, then Istio will provide you the DNS point. You don't have to configure core DNS. I think that's going to be a critical piece from a UX perspective, right? However, if you do happen to have like a cloud provider or a Karmata or whatever else of an MCS implementation, then Istio will be able to sort of delegate that responsibility to the MCS controller or the general environment.
One of the things that Louis is saying does resonate with me as far as like I'm actively involved in MCS, a fan of the API for what it's worth. One of the explicit constraints is the like sameness assumption, and with what we're doing with V1 Alpha 2 service import, it is going to basically lock us into that to some extent because we're basically removing the ability to have a like user authored service import like outside of that sameness boundary. So that works well in the few large clusters. It works well for the team managing a handful of clusters case. where that starts to break is I have also noticed this trend of like organizations with many clusters where each team is managing a few clusters. And at that, you're starting to look at like the boundary between clusters is not direct. They're not all in the same cluster set. If you have multiple cluster sets and you're going through an ingress or something like that to reach another team's clusters.
Yeah, so I would prefer not to reopen the namespace sameness debate for Ambient if that's possible.
I'm not suggesting that.
Well, I mean, isn't that like if like other than identity sameness, right? So we're not going to reopen the service account sameness debate, right? Which is orthogonal, a little bit orthogonal to this, but related, right?
Yes.
You know, if service A with, you know, with a specific name and namespace is backed by workloads with a workload identity, and that workload identity set varies wildly if you cross cluster boundaries, right? That's also probably going to violate people's expectations, right? Like,
Right.
unless they really know what they're doing, right? Which, right, that one's hard. So they are a little bit tied. Now, if it's the global versus local for a load balancing choice, you know, that's more understandable, right? Because you're offering you're going to teams and saying, hey, you know, you're starting out and you either explicitly want to talk local or you explicitly want to talk globally, and you're going to tell us by DNS. That's how you're going to tell us. And it's just, are we sufficiently bifurcated on that or not? And yeah, I think we're just going to see users fall into two camps, right? With the ones who want sameness and the ones who don't. For service addressing sameness, not identity sameness.
I would agree. I think even if we're talking about, you know, it's probably not 50-50. It may be like a 70-30 or a 80-20. But I think that the users who are doing this are have such a razor thin margin for error and such a complex setup that we can't afford to ignore either of them. And so I do think that, you know, I'm depending on what the API, I don't know how complex you mean when you talk about API, Louis, but whether it's a config map or a config map setting or like a literal flag to pilot, I do think that it makes sense to allow to have some way to basically say it's cluster local or not. So maybe a way of rephrasing this goal is be able to keep cluster.local. We're proposing that we add this capability in Istio, which does not exist today. Because I don't think there's anything in the proposal as we read through. I don't think there's anything in here that prevents that. Yeah, I don't think anything's preventing that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
So then
I'm also fully sorry.
I'll go ahead, Mike.
I was gonna say, yeah, I'm fully on board with like keeping everything like the sameness construct makes a lot of sense and makes a lot of things easier within the scope of a mesh. And the way, if you need to get outside of that, the way to do it is not to break that in the mesh, it's to use DNS to go outside the mesh. And if you have like multiple mesh control planes or something like that, like you're crossing a boundary there.
So I wonder if it makes sense to add this as like, it's not exactly a requirement, I think is what I'm hearing, Louis. It's not that you want us to write into the multi-cluster design a fine-grained way to control which domain names resolve to multi-cluster IP addresses versus which ones stay local, but rather that our design be compatible with that in the future. That we not preclude the possibility of giving customers that control or users that control. Is that what I'm hearing?
I mean, I would like to go a little bit further than that. Like, I think it's worthwhile putting some effort into trying to specify what the controls might be and to do a little bit of external validation on them. At least get some feedback on it. Like just based just on my recent experience in customer calls, right? I would be very nervous about not having a clear answer for like the very types of customers for whom this feature is critical.
Okay.
Right, the ones with fleets, right? If you've just got one cluster, this is irrelevant. Right, the people for whom this really becomes critical are the ones with at least moderate numbers of clusters.
This use case makes sense to me. Like it definitely resonates. It's like a thing that we should consider how it would be implemented.
Yeah. Right. And the other is obviously funkiness here is workloads that don't run inside of Kubernetes, right? That we name and enroll into Kubernetes services. They are as subject to migration across cluster boundaries, or even being mapped into multiple clusters, in some cases, as anything else. Right, our existing VM scheme, right, basically mounts logical pods, and Kubernetes doesn't define any semantics for those, really. Neither does the MCS API. So Istio actually had to invent that, and we still need a consistent story for those as well.
Are you referring to service entry there, or?
Workload entry and the ability to select workload entries via service, but also service entry.
Yeah, I was thinking of service entry in that context of you have a single, strongly consistent data store or something like that you have many clusters are addressing independently, but it's not like a service that's running in any one of those clusters. Like, totally reasonable thing to, yeah.
But workload entry is also a thing that currently you can map the same workload entry into multiple clusters. So it can be co-resident, right? So it's not for Kubernetes semantics of cluster.local, it's not actually cluster.local because it's mapped into many places.
Okay.
Well, how relevant is this for Ambient though? Because we currently don't support workload entry, workload group, VMs, or any of that with Ambient today.
John, like other than whether it actually runs on a VM or not, I suspect workload entry works for endpoint discovery.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Sorry, I thought it was muted. Yeah, it works fine.
I mean, but it's like explicitly out of scope for beta, meaning it's out of
Yeah,
scope for
I mean,
GA.
like, because that's mostly because we didn't do any environmental testing of like running the workload on the VM, Keith. It actually works. Like we get to make a choice about what's supported, but like we would have to we need to make an argument about whether we change the model that we already have, right? Because then we're talking about changing the definition of the workload entry API.
Could someone just very briefly clarify the difference between workload entry and service entry?
Sure. A workload entry is a pseudopod. So it's the definition of a workload that can then be selected into services. So it has labels, it has an identity. A service entry is a more primitive networking concept in that the definition of a name and a set of endpoints that implement the name. But it is not composable via Kubernetes semantics because it's not a pod.
Okay, thanks, that helps.
Yeah. And we use workload entry and workload group as part of the attestation flow when generating identity credentials for workloads that belong to that group, right? So they're part of the attestation flow, which there's no such thing for service entries. This is a concept that Kubernetes has flirted with down the years, workload entry and workload group, but never actually implemented.
So is your point, Louis, then that if we don't keep cluster set, if we don't keep cluster local, if we change the Istio understanding of what cluster.local means, and when we make cluster local, then that will somehow negatively impact the functionality of workload entry and
Well, not necessarily.
workload group.
I get. It's more just like we want to be clear about the semantics. We would just have to say, right? So
Oh, sure.
if right, so if you said, look, if you put the same workload entry into two different clusters, well, it's cluster.local in both, right? Is really what it would be saying, and we just have to document that. Just right,
Gotcha.
I'm just pointing out for completeness that it's a thing that we would have to document in the semantics of the APIs.
Gotcha. Okay, totally fair. Totally fair. And yeah, there's a, because you can have a workload entry pod without a service entry. Is that correct? Or do you need a service entry to sort of define the
No,
networking properties of that workload entry?
No, you can select a workload entry with a service. Not even, you don't need service entry to do it.
Yeah, so you could end up
Okay.
with a Kubernetes native service selecting workload entries in two completely disparate, unconnected clusters that happen to be referencing the same actual thing that lives outside of them.
Got
Is
it.
that accurate?
Got it.
Yeah, we can add like an appendix section that deals with those semantics. I mean, my gut tells me just treat those as local to every cluster where they're defined. Right? If
Yeah,
you have
I mean,
one
yeah.
VM and you put it in every cluster in your multi-cluster installation, it's local to all of them. Load balancing is going to be ugly, but you've defined the same thing multiple times. So
Yeah, and that's probably the right semantic, although the workload will only attest with one of the clusters. But as long as your identities are normalized, that should be okay.
right.
Yeah, I think that generally makes sense to me as well. But like Mitch said, we can discuss. But that's a good call out to basically make sure we round this out for completeness.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so just on the DNS names themselves, right? So aside from overloading the semantics of cluster.local, what other semantics do we want or think users might want, right? So there's the non-overloaded form of cluster.local, and then there's something.global. Is there something in between?
I mean, cluster. It depends. It depends on how we want to do this. So what we're proposing in this doc is to make the MCS for the cluster local equals cluster local use case. Your cluster, we go full MCS and do cluster sets, and within cluster sets, we can make a variety of assumptions about namespace sameness and things like that we can't necessarily make with just plain Istio. So the idea is that if you are using, the proposal using to use cluster set.local, and so anything within a cluster set would be, a service would be the same. We would assume the namespace exists. Notably, we'd also expect customers to deploy waypoints evenly. So the east-west gateway will make the eventual decision. But in general, we tend to this proposal sticks within the MCS API guardrails, where we basically treat it as one large geo-distributed cluster within a cluster set.
Okay, but there's remembering my MCS, right? Cluster set is not a variable name, it is a fixed name, right? So it's just a cluster belongs to one and only one cluster set.
Correct.
Right, so the obvious question would be, right, what is the discovery horizon of the one and only one cluster set that's available to me? And two, is that actually what the application developer wants, as opposed to be able to name logical groupings, right, and not the physical grouping? So like global, regional, zonal would be logical groupings.
So again, what we're proposing here is multi-network, multi-cluster ambient. It sounds like you're getting at, Louis, is more of the federation use case, which is not exactly what we're trying to cover.
Well, we're proposing to adopt MCS semantics for DNS. right, as part of this proposal. So regardless of the implementation details of multi-network and load balancing and all that kind of stuff, right, that comes
Sure.
with a whole bunch of effects. I understand why MCS did what it did. It doesn't seem that it has universally solved people's problems or met their needs. It does things, it does useful things, but is it doing everything it can be doing? Right, and some of that
No,
is
it's
inherent.
absolutely not a complete solution.
Right, and so like if we were to go like this, we can choose not to align with MCS, or we can choose to align, or we can choose to do both. I don't just want to. I'd like to have a little bit more expansive view of the options and what users actually want the semantics of their names to mean. Like MCS does what it does because there was a setup where I would create a fixed grouping of clusters. Clusters could only be members of one cluster set. Right, because otherwise, because of the fixed addressing scheme, that would cause disuniform addressing if I didn't do that. Long ago, Istio chose not to fully adopt Kubernetes schemes because of requirements that we got from users about the utility of not having to refactor their DNS all the time. And so I don't want to necessarily lose that as a kind of top level goal to give users the ideal UX. Like, I know Custom's not here, but like we talk about .global because it has a semantic, right? Which means I'm willing to, when I address this service, I'm willing to go to an endpoint no matter where it is. Right? That's what I'm saying as an application owner, right? That's the thing that I'm saying. The infrastructure may do whatever, but that's what my requirement is. What other requirements my application owners say, irrespective of the infrastructure, because the name is the interface that they have into the system.
Right, but by that point, Louis, when you're making a request to a cluster set, there is semantic, a consent to the semantics of a cluster set at that point, right? If at some point Istio chooses to do a .global, we can add additional semantics on top of that. But MCS feels like or rather, what using the MCS semantics gives us feels like a reasonable slice of functionality that's not currently available.
Well, I would say MCS gives the administrator a way to establish the boundaries of discovery. It's not a way for the application developer to express their requirements on discovery. Right, those are two different things. If that, like, hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, like MCS does not have a way to, like, when you as an application, like end user, app dev end user, like if you write, I am making an API call to .clusterset.local, there is not currently a way within the MCS API to express like desired zone aware routing, topology, load balancing, things like that. There have been like 3 or something attempts to improve this and like add abilities to do this kind of stuff within Kubernetes itself. And I think that is the path that MCS would intend to be compatible with rather than trying to define it themselves. So that's like for like zone aware routing or something like that, being able to write policy within Kubernetes and attach that to a service import or something like that, of like, I want to first route to cluster local, and then if latency is too high, if it's overloaded, whatever, then as a backup route off cluster, or like only route off cluster if nothing is available locally.
Right. So there's
like that's limited. Like that, if you have things that live outside the cluster or outside that cluster set boundary, if you have one team is managing their cluster set, another team is managing a separate cluster set that are like two different worlds, and you need to reach across them, DNS is probably your way to do that, rather than expecting MCS to solve that.
Mitch,
Mitch,
you
you got
have
it?
Yeah, I think we're wrestling with the difference between this design and everything we might ever do with multi-cluster. The purpose of this design
That's
is to
fair.
bring forward our existing sidecar multi-cluster functionality, multi-network functionality, to make some minor adjustments to bring it in line with other Kubernetes standards so that we're not routing in a very unique way. But it doesn't preclude us from building other things on top of multi-cluster. Like if we want to have membership in multiple cluster sets so that you're doing like I guess it'd be similar to micro-segmentation based on cluster membership. This doesn't preclude that. It simply doesn't include that. The goal is to get our baseline multi-cluster functionality moved to Ambient. And if we want to substantially expand or reimagine how multi-cluster works, I don't think there's anything in this design that would prevent that. It's just not the right place for that particular discussion in terms of design and implementation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that was what I was gonna say as well. Like I think that when users, to Louis' point, when users pick cluster and they send to cluster.local, they're opting into one set of semantics. We can easily use DNS as the switch for flipping into other semantics in the future.
Well, I agree with everything up until that easy part. Right. like
Fair.
the one,
I'll give you that.
Right. Like, I don't think we can reasonably expect users, right, particularly ones spanning like many Kubernetes cluster implementations, to easily configure DNS. Right. It just isn't easy. Right. It was a big headache in MCS, if I remember rightly. To get consistency among the DNS implementations for it. So I view with extreme skepticism the ability to tell admins, hey, if you want to change the semantics, just go do some stuff in DNS.
Well, and I wouldn't propose that necessarily at this point.
Okay.
I would simply say, like, maybe we can implement that inside of Istio. Maybe there's some sort of a client-side API that helps you resolve and choose what clusters to go to. But I don't think it's part of the multi-cluster MVP. Does that make sense?
I think we're for everything in the MVP, yes, just the only thing being the redefinition of cluster.local, which we're just gonna have to settle on that, right? Like we have to choose. The more advanced features, yes, we can obviously defer or run on a separate track.
So if cluster.local routing was set behind an install time flag, is that enough for MVP, do you think, Louis, or is there more that needs to be discussed?
No, that's probably sufficient. Yeah, we can work out the details of where it lives.
Okay. I'll document that here, and then I'll this section here I'll call as like a future growth. We'd like selective cluster.local routing and controls there. And once we have the baseline multi-cluster functionality working, we can start running some experiments to see what we can do with DNS or what might need a client-side API. Today, it would be difficult to experiment in that fashion.
It's probably not that difficult to experiment with it, right? I mean, yeah, we have to pick some names and things like that, but maybe suggest that we start at least an outline of a design document for what these policy controls might look like, just so we make sure we don't dig ourselves any holes. But
I think that sounds great. And I'd be happy to collaborate with you on that.
Okay. I'm sure Costin will be more than happy to collaborate on that too.
Just say DNS and Costin will pop up out of nowhere.
Yeah. It's like saying Beetlejuice, right?
So I want to get a handful of people's time. We're 45 minutes in. I don't think there was anything else on the agenda, so we can keep going with this discussion if we'd like, but I want to make sure we're not pushing anybody else out here.
Yes. So maybe we should talk about special case handling in HBone clients and servers.
Yes, so this is things like at one point there is a proposal for only encrypting the data part of the stream of H2 and keeping the rest clear text, sort of as a multi-network mechanism. Like that's the sort of special casing
Yeah,
that
that
we're
seems
trying to
pretty
avoid.
pretty funky.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
I mean the big ones here are like, what are east-west gateways allowed to terminate? Right. I mean that's essentially the most important question, other than like, does the tunneling actually work?
Yep.
The reasons why, like we have, and you know, to prevent internet access, right, is one of the reasons why we have the east-west gateway at least terminate something, right, to authenticate it.
Yes.
The second question about kind of terminate the inner thing, right? If we're doing, say, double H bone, typically the arguments there are around telemetry and security. And right, some people say I want the ability to inspect all the traffic at the edges of my network, and so I'm going to terminate everything, or I want to terminate everything. And tell me how to solve the trust issues end to end when I do that. Which, you know, is a whole complex set of things. It's a bit more like waypoints.
Exactly. Right.
And then there's the, no, I want to end-to-end zero trust. And so please, East-West Gateway, don't terminate. And I'll deal with the security implications at the leads. I don't know that, I haven't heard users express strong opinions about these either way when I presented this as a question. And so I don't feel in a good position to be able to state hard requirements either way. So this is one of those where I will run into a hard requirement someday, for sure. I guarantee you will run into somebody someday who'll say, look, I need to terminate everything at the East-West Gateway because I want to run DPI on it or something like that. But we're just not there yet with users being able to answer those questions. So I would like to preserve some optionality, I guess. That's all.
Yeah. So Mitch, if you scroll down a little bit so we can get that full diagram.
Yeah.
What we're proposing here, at least at this point, for the protocol is to where the East-West Gateway only terminates that first layer of HBOM. One thing to note here that John brought up in the comments is that we are using the zTunnels client cert for that outer layer. And what this does is it kind of, because we're terminating only the outer, not the inner, it inherently preserves the validation on the server side. And in that way, it can remain sort of completely unchanged from single network. So the zTunnel is still going to audit the server SAN. There are still certificates. The East-West Gateway will just kind of transparently or opaquely TCP proxy the inner payload, and the server zTunnel will be able to validate that way. You do have some. There is a bit of a break in telemetry where it might be hard to associate different spans, for example, where the East-West Gateway gets a request. We know it came from this zTunnel from this remote IP address, but do we necessarily associate that with the server-side zTunnel kind of end-to-end? That's definitely a question. We may be able to use baggage. We reserved a header in the HBOM protocol, so we could use baggage for that telemetry on the zTunnel server side. Well, actually, to the inner stream, so actually we can't.
Yeah.
But that's an open question for sure on the telemetry side. But I do like the idea of sort of inherently preventing ourselves from getting into a situation where we just sort of nakedly forward things through without validating where they're coming from or where it's going. So that was sort of the decision, the trade-offs we made here. And I put that in there in the security considerations.
Okay. So the obviously the inner is what we send around today, right? I don't think that any of that needs to change.
With one exception, one exception is that the authority of the inner is now a service IP, and it's the remote services service IP at the Z tunnel. And this comes from the requirement of making sure that control planes don't have to be global, and don't have to understand all the endpoints and preventing the n squared contextualization problem.
Yeah, so I think the options here are service IP or service name, right?
Correct.
Right. Yep.
With the understanding that HBone today does not support host names, and that is a form of special casing as well. So now we're changing the protocols. All existing HBone has to now be able to understand a host name, whereas it wouldn't before. So there's some special casing concerns there. So we went with the VIP option, just to sort of avoid some of that.
Although I think we're probably likely to run into that anyway in the egress case, right? John, I think I remember chatting with you about that.
Like the egress gateway use case for HBone?
Right. Yeah. Where like it would be useful to have a host authority instead of an IP because there was no allocated IP.
Yeah, I think there's probably a number of compelling reasons to allow hostname as the authority in HBone, but this multi-cluster use case just isn't one of them. I don't believe there's a downside to using remote service IP unless, Louis, you see something there.
Stability. Right, what's like remote service IPs are basically VIPs in the remote network, right?
Correct. So there's the propagation question when the IP just changes, right? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So what's more likely to change? I the VIPs should change more often than the host names. Okay.
That is true. That's true, but in theory, the east-west gateways is the one using the authority header to do routing. And it's going to get that configuration from STOD.
Yeah, but it won't do that in the inner. Right, the client-side Z tunnel will be doing it for the inner.
That's true. I think what I'm saying generally though is that the STOD of that's sending the request. Sorry, the STOD that programs the Z tunnel sending the request is getting the information from the same source as the remote Z tunnel, east-west gateway, etc.
Yeah, I mean, like all things being equal, right? They are equivalent. But in like when we're looking at maximum reliability, there might be some drift between what the two are seeing at any given moment in time, and so which is a more stable representation. I don't have a very hard opinion about this, but I think I suspect this is one place where we can make adjustments in the protocol, and it's probably not that difficult if we felt it was necessary.
Yeah, if we had hostname support today, I would have no hesitation of saying, sure, let's use hostname for authority. My only hesitation is I want to tie this to as few other future work efforts as possible, mostly just to be able to get an approval on it.
Yeah, +1
right,
to all that.
Well, maybe just put that in the doc and say, look, all things being equal, if hostname support existed and was stable, we may actually prefer it.
Sorry, I missed some context, but we don't support VIP in authority either way, so we still need to do something. So maybe we should just do the right one.
Yeah.
We only support concrete IP.
Like it has to be the specific pod IP. Yeah.
Today, yes, correct. For me, the decision came down to kind of a parsing thing, and is there an error, a more graceful error if we can parse the VIP or what have you.
Honestly, I think it's harder to do VIP than hostname, probably. But
Yeah, what I think I'm hearing is that there are already some reasons why we might have considered using hostname, namely the egress case that Louis mentioned. In addition to this, if we had general agreement about adding hostname for that, then I would agree to just do it right the first time, since that would be the ideal. Honestly, I thought that would be more controversial. But if not, then I see no reason to start with remote. It does make things easier to use hostname versus the remote VIP. Less mapping to do and indices and stuff.
Interestingly, our protocol doc actually specifically uses host names and IP addresses in the authority field.
Yeah, like remembering back to the early days of HBone, like one of the reasons we did that, HBone is supposed to be an interop standard, effectively. And so, right, like the hypothetical example we used to give was a mobile client, right? Using HBone WebSocket, HBone is WebSocket, talking to a public endpoint. There's no way. They would never send an IP or a VIP, right? They would always send hostname and the authority if you were going in through an ELD or an XLD or whatever. And so, like purely from an interop point of view, you'd probably want to be able to support authority being hostname.
Okay, I think there's general consensus there on that point then, if I'm understanding everybody correctly.
I seem to recall some sort of concerns around SNI when we did hostname authority, but I'm not sure I remember what the actual concern was. Does that?
That's the reverse. So the reason
Okay.
and that's actually lower in the doc. The reason we can't use SNI is because SNI only allows host names and not IP addresses.
Okay, I was getting it backwards. Thank you.
And no port is also a big issue.
Yeah.
Correct. Yes. Yes.
Now we may, like, we're not necessarily adopting CN semantics, right, or X509 CN verification of the allowed host names within the TLS stream. That, right, again, should be part of the H1 specification. We would obviously like them, but the certificates that we issue for servers, the spiffy style ones, we don't use CNs right now. So that will be a thing, particularly on the public internet. If we start to support it, we'll have to address extended X509 verification semantics with the authority. Which, again, on the public internet, like none of that would ever work with IPs. So,
yeah.
Yep, that's fair. We are right about at time. We've got a minute left, so we can continue discussing this in the next meeting that we have. Also, feel free. Like, I think it's actually will work better if folks can find some time to review asynchronously and leave comments. This has been my focus for a little while. Happy to respond to questions to me directly if there's any big issues. But and yeah, we got a couple of things here where we can flesh out some more details. And I think the big takeaway is to encode the authority as a host name instead of a remote service IP, which makes things simpler. So happy to capture that.
Support both, and then we can, yeah, I mean, the Z-tunnel should support both. And the gateway, yeah, we'll have to figure out what the gateway can do. So, but yes.
I've moved that to the still in review section on our Ambient meeting notes so that we can be reminded to check back in on it from time to time.
Yeah. Can we start a dedicated sub-thread on this in Ambient Dev? We can do a little cat herding on these topics offline. It's definitely worth it. So, yeah.
Okay, yeah, I'll get that started. All right.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for the feedback. Appreciate it.
Yeah, no, appreciate it, guys.
Take care.